Is democracy possible? Is it even desirable? To both these questions, James Burnham answered, absolutely not. If you're looking for a book that will challenge your political worldview and perhaps your faith in democracy, look no further than The Machiavellians by James Burnham. Quick side note, I'm leaving available my first video, which covers much of the same material as this one. YouTube banned my channel temporarily after finding my first video somehow guilty of fraud. I appealed the ban, and YouTube, to their credit, reinstated my channel. Curiously enough, YouTube did not really explain what it was about my video that was so fraudulent. Perhaps Burnham's insights into the powers that be were a little too observant for them. Regardless, I'm somewhat proud that my first video ever triggered the censors at YouTube, so I'm leaving it up for posterity. Anyways, let's return to one of the most illuminating works of political theory in the 20th century, The Machiavellians by James Burnham. First, a brief biography of Burnham. He was born in 1905 to a wealthy Chicago family. His father was an English immigrant and an executive of the Burlington Road. Burnham attended Oxford University, where he studied under professors J.R.R. Tolkien and Martin Darcy. In 1929, he became a professor of philosophy at New York University, and a Trotskyist in the 1930s. Burnham ironically went on to become a founding leader of the conservative movement that emerged after World War II. He also helped William F. Buckley found the conservative magazine National Review. Sort of tangentially related to the book, this represented a key development in the formation of a conscious and organized conservative movement. Of course, conservative ideas existed prior to the 1950s, but individuals who ascribed to them did not formally gather themselves into an organized movement until the 1950s. Burnham's ideas influenced some of the most provocative thinkers of his time and ours, from George Orwell and Dwight MacDonald to Paul Gottfried and Curtis Yarvin. In The Machiavellians, Burnham sought to dismantle common perceptions of democracy in order to offer a more systematic and realistic understanding of politics and power. Indeed, Burnham retained aspects of his Marxian background in the sense that he viewed the world as a series of systems inevitably heading in a single historical direction. This is perhaps the most common criticism of Burnham's work, but the following is not intended as a critical review of the Machiavellians, though that may come in later episodes. Rather, the following represents a summary of his book, with the intention of steel-manning his argument and representing it in the strongest possible light. Contrary to modern popular opinion, Burnham did not uphold democracy as a universal good. Quite the contrary, he believed democracy never existed and it never could. Borrowing from Gaetano Mosca, Robert Michels, George Sorel, and Vilfredo Pareto, Burnham observed that throughout history, power always congeals into the hands of a few powerful individuals. This phenomenon Mosca called the theory of the ruling class, and Michels named the iron law of oligarchy. Moreover, Burnham argued even if democracy could exist, it never should, because it is not a stable system of government. Burnham notes that throughout history, democracies have a historical tendency to be short-lived, and furthermore, even if the masses could attain power, they would not be competent wielders of it. Indeed, Burnham's arguments stand in stark contrast to modern preferences in the West for democracy. Nevertheless, if Westerners wish to defend and retain their democracies, whether real or imagined, they must understand the strongest arguments against them. And it is precisely for this reason that Burnham's devastating critiques of democratic self-government remain much under-discussed. Burnham observed a fundamental weakness in democratic political theories. For him, these ideologies overlooked the harsh realities of politics and power. Instead of taking these worldviews for granted, Burnham advanced a realistic approach to politics, divorced from all ideology. As he said in his preface, "Through the Machiavellians, I began to understand more thoroughly what I had long felt, that only by renouncing all ideology can we begin to see the world and man." Burnham's approach to understanding politics required shedding one's firmly held worldviews, and instead analyzing the world through a calculated examination of the mechanisms and methods by which rulers achieve and maintain power. Accordingly, Burnham's book invites his reader to take off the rose-tinted glasses of democracy, and all political ideology for that matter, and view the world instead through a more realistic lens. The primary purpose of Burnham's work in the Machiavellians is to illustrate and advocate a realistic and even scientific approach to power and politics. This, he tells us, is the Machiavellian tradition. Indeed, Machiavelli is often regarded as the first political scientist. Similarly to the scientific method of observing natural phenomena to derive laws of nature, Machiavelli used historical facts and data in the attempt to identify laws of politics. Put another way, since Machiavelli believed politics and power to be the same thing, one could say he endeavored to discover laws of power. Burnham identified 4 political thinkers who followed Machiavelli's scientific examination of power and politics: Gaetano Mosca, Robert Michels, Georges Sorel, and Vilfredo Pareto. For Burnham, these individuals embodied the Machiavellian tradition of dispassionate political analysis. They were the intellectual heirs of Machiavelli's cold, calculated methodology. They were men who understood politics to be, primarily, a game of power. They were shrewd, original thinkers who sought a scholarly understanding of the mechanisms of power in society. They were the Machiavellians. Before introducing the Machiavellians and each of their original insights in parts 3 through 6, Burnham explains the most important aspects of Machiavelli's political thought in parts 1 and 2. From these foundational ideas, Burnham lays down the intellectual tradition of the Machiavellians. But before surveying Machiavelli's thought, Burnham first addressed Machiavelli's infamous reputation. Burnham's book basically stands as an apology for Machiavellianism, a word commonly associated with the worst despots in history, thus prompting Burnham to explain why his promotion of Machiavellian thought is not meant to be an apology for ruthless tyrants. As Burnham pointed out, Machiavelli himself did not uphold monarchy, let alone tyranny, as an ideal form of government. Rather, Machiavelli preferred republican government, but believed monarchy best suited the Italy of his time, and promised his country the greatest possible degree of prosperity, security, and most important for Machiavelli, independence. For Machiavelli, independence is the first condition of freedom, and it is in this spirit that Burnham subtitled his book, Defenders of Freedom. Despite his desire to realize the greatest degree of freedom in Italy, Machiavelli's name became synonymous with the worst forms of despotism. Other than maybe Nero, Hitler, and Judas Iscariot, perhaps no one in history is more associated with evil than Machiavelli. His name is even used as a category of sociopathic personalities in the Dark Triad theory. But this fate was probably unfair to Machiavelli. Machiavelli himself stated that the purpose of his writing was not to encourage brutal, cynical tyranny, and even in his own time, Machiavelli felt the need to defend himself against the aspersion that he intended to provide a handbook for despotism. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "I come now to the last branch of my charge, that I teach princes villainy and how to enslave. If any man will read my book, with impartiality and ordinary charity, he will easily perceive that it is not my intention to recommend that government to those men there described to the world, much less to teach men how to trample upon good men, and all that is sacred and venerable upon earth, laws, religion, honesty, and whatnot. If I have been a little too punctual in describing these monsters in all their lineaments and colors, I hope mankind will know them, the better to avoid them, my treatise both being a satire against them and a true character of them." Parts 1 and 2 of the Machiavellians may be summarized into 10 general conclusions. The first 2 take a little longer to describe, if you will bear with me, as they are likely the least familiar to a general audience. First, and perhaps foremost of Burnham's conclusions that he drew from Machiavelli, is Machiavelli's relativist approach to government. For a philosopher so associated with tyrannical autocracy, it may come as a surprise to learn that Machiavelli maintained a remarkably relativistic approach to politics. But this is not so shocking given his determination to place realism above ideology. Machiavelli believed that no one system of government suits all nations and at all times. Conversely, he argued, the optimal system of government varies between countries and across time. Put another way, a system of government that suits a particular country might not work so well at all in a different country. Likewise, a system of government that works well in a country for a period of time might not work so great in that same country at a different period of time. In fact, as history teaches us, no one system of government ever survived indefinitely. Thus, identifying the ideal form of government for a given country requires complete abandonment of one's ideological commitments. After years of thoughtful study, Machiavelli concluded, against his Republican preferences, that monarchy promised Italy the greatest degree of independence, security, and prosperity. And it is important to note the context of Machiavelli's writings. Machiavelli wrote his famous work, The Prince, during a period of transition from feudalism to capitalism in Italy. As the first seeds of capitalism germinated, a successful merchant class from the small city-states of Venice, Milan, and Florence emerged to challenge the power of the feudal lords. Through their extensive trade networks, these cities came to dominate northern Italy, though a portion of the rural areas still toiled under feudal subjugation. But these city-states remained ununited, and this fragmentation of Italy left the country open to constant invasions. As Burnham explained, control over the city-states and territories shifted every decade, from Normans to Spaniards to Frenchmen to local bosses to Germans to popes and back again. Nevertheless, the amazing city-states of the north had made Italy, during the 14th and 15th centuries, the center of Europe. Machiavelli concluded that a strong monarch who could unite Italy and her magnificent city-states provided the greatest chance of defending Italy from military invasion. Moreover, a strong, unified central government served not only to protect Italy's security, but to support the burgeoning system of capitalism. Until the 15th century, Burnham notes, attempts by the kings to consolidate a strong central government always met stiff and mostly successful resistance from the feudal lords. Furthermore, the feudalist system did not lend itself well to a modern, unified nation-state. Feudalism lacked the socio-economic characteristics and networks of the emerging capitalist system, such as increased manufacturing, elevated exchange of currency, extensive foreign trade, and greater ease of transportation and communication. These features of capitalism spread a network of socioeconomic connections across Italy upon which a unified nation-state could emerge. The transition from feudalism to capitalism meant an increased attention to and dependency upon foreign trade. Eventually, the city-states gained enough power to police transportation routes and protect the safe exchange of foreign trade. But as the scale of markets increased, foreign trade required uniform currency, standardized systems of taxation, and other regulations. For Machiavelli, a modern nation-state could provide a uniform system of trade, secure foreign trade routes, and protect Italy from invaders. In Machiavelli's view, monarchy offered the most expedient route for Italy to realize a modern nation-state. A secure and prosperous Italy required uniting the peninsula both politically and economically. It is worth noting, as Burnham points out, that Machiavelli's position on monarchy opposed that of another famous Italian Renaissance author, Dante Alighieri. Contrary to historians who hailed Dante as the first modern man, Burnham saw a propagandist on the side of the feudal nobility and opposed to the emerging system of capitalism, which threatened to upset the power and privileges that the nobility enjoyed under the feudal social system. Dante won the title as the first modern man for being among the initial proponents for the separation of church and state in De Monarchia. But for Burnham, Dante's treatise is really a work of propaganda on behalf of the feudal lords, who were threatened by the papacy's support of the emerging merchant class in the cities. Ironically, as Burnham pointed out, the papacy was supporting the most progressive developments in society. Nevertheless, in the Machiavellian sense, though Dante lost the battle, he won the war in the history books. While scholars still think of Dante as the first modern man, Machiavelli's name remains nearly synonymous with evil, which brings us to the second conclusion Burnham drew from Machiavelli, real and formal meaning. One of the most illuminating concepts that Burnham drew from Machiavelli, though the latter did not put it in these terms, is the distinction between real and formal meaning of political speech. Burnham defined formal meaning of political speech as that which is explicitly stated, or accepting words at face value. In the case of Dante, the formal meaning of De Monarchia is an advocation of the separation of church and state. For Burnham, however, De Monarchia amounts to a propagandistic defense of the feudal nobility and the feudal system. To take a different, more modern example, the term democracy formally means government by the people, of the people, for the people, as Abraham Lincoln defined it in his Gettysburg Address. But such formalisms rarely translate to reality. Just because a nation calls itself democratic does not mean that it operates democratically. For example, it would be absurd to suggest that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea operates as a democracy or a republic, let alone on behalf of its people. Likewise, though we Americans like to describe our system as a democracy or a republic, if we are to be truly honest with ourselves, it is more accurate to describe our system as some form of oligarchy. What then is the real meaning of democracy or republic? Burnham proposed that the real meaning of such political language can be determined by its instrumental, practical value. In other words, the real meaning of political speech relates to how said speech influences reality. Returning to the previous examples, Throwing around terms like democracy does not make a nation more democratic, but it does at least have the effect of convincing a good number of people that they live under a democracy and that their voice is heard. Though both of these assumptions are delusional, at least for Burnham, these fictions nevertheless serve to support the status quo. The system is reinforced by the people's belief that their voice is heard. Such myths serve an important function in society, as George Sorel observed. Even if a political system remains an oligarchy, the people are not bothered by this, for they are under the impression that they live under a government by the people, of the people, and for the people. Thus, the illusion of democracy quells the masses and reinforces the stability of the government. Understanding the real meaning of political language requires careful study and understanding of its historical context. Indeed, Burnham's realist approach to politics necessitates more than simply taking political speech for granted. We often get caught up in the literal meaning of the words and speech politicians deploy, taking their words at face value and as they are explicitly stated, as if politicians genuinely mean what they say. Burnham illustrated this dialectic between real and formal meaning of political speech in a powerful passage juxtaposing the two alongside each other. Quote, "We believe we are disputing the merits of a balanced budget and a sound currency, when the real conflict is deciding what group shall regulate the distribution of the currency. We imagine we are arguing over the moral and legal status of the principle of the freedom of the seas, when the real question is who is to control the seas." For Burnham, deducing the real meaning of political speech from its formal meaning requires careful study of the context in which it occurred and investigating the powerful interests behind political propaganda. Moreover, to discern the real meaning from the formal meaning of political speech, Burnham believed one must employ Machiavelli's realistic analysis of power, with careful observance of the relevant historical facts and context. Through his attempt to derive historical and political conclusions from first principles, however limited an approach may be in the intangible realm of politics and history, Machiavelli rightfully earned his distinction as the first political scientist. This leads to the third conclusion Burnham drew from Machiavelli, the principle of the rulers and the ruled. Machiavelli asserted that only two types of people exist in the political world, the rulers and the ruled. But Machiavelli did not believe that the rulers were necessarily superior to the ruled. As Burnham explained, the ruled majority, changeable, weak, short-sighted, selfish, is not at all, for Machiavelli, the black to the ruler's white. Indeed, for him, the ruler type is even less constant, less loyal, and on many occasions, less intelligent. Nevertheless, every society in history contained a ruling class. Again, drawing from Michel's theory of the ruling class and Mosca's iron law of oligarchy, Burnham observed that power always accumulates into the hands of a minority. This leads to the fourth conclusion Burnham drew from Machiavelli, the concept of virtù. Machiavelli defined virtù as the defining characteristic of the ruling class. But by virtù, Machiavelli did not mean the modern English virtue. In fact, according to Burnham, Machiavelli's virtù has no English equivalent. The modern meaning of virtue implies moral overtones, whereas Machiavelli's virtù expressed the instrumental value of certain character traits. Machiavelli's virtù meant a set of characteristics necessary to advance oneself in society. Akin to Plato's thumos, Machiavelli's concept of virtù included traits like ambition, drive, and the will to power. Most important for Machiavelli, to be a ruler, one must acquire two prerequisite attributes: martial strength and a cunning instinct for deception. Which leads us to the fifth conclusion Burnham drew from Machiavelli, the principle of force and fraud. For Machiavelli, rulers attain power in only two ways: force and fraud. As Burnham elaborated, war and fighting are the great training ground of rule, Machiavelli believes, and power is only secure on the basis of force. However, an even more common characteristic of the ruling class is fraud. In his Discourses on Livy, Book 2, Chapter 13, Machiavelli generalized that from mean to great fortune, people rise rather by fraud than by force. Machiavelli illustrated this combination of force and fraud in his famous passages from The Prince, which described the successful ruler as assuming the attributes of both the lion and the fox. For the lion is in danger of toils and snares, and the fox of the wolf, so that he must be a fox to find out the snares, and a lion to fright away the wolves. from The Prince, chapter 18. This relates to the sixth conclusion Burnham drew from Machiavelli, that political life is in flux. It is always changing and never constant. As Burnham said, there is no way of avoiding this change. Any idea of a perfect state, or even a reasonably good state, that could last indefinitely is an illusion. For, in Machiavelli's words, virtue begets peace, peace begets idleness, idleness mutiny, and mutiny destruction. And then, vice versa, that ruin begets laws, those laws virtue, and virtue begets honor and good success. From the History of Florence, Book 5. And interestingly enough, this quote bears striking resemblance to the modern adage, strong men make good times make weak men make hard times, and hard times make strong men. As Burnham put it, Machiavelli believed this, quote, recurring pattern of change expresses the more or less permanent core of human nature as it functions politically. And this concept of flux relates closely to the seventh conclusion Burnham drew from Machiavelli, the concept of adaptation. Since political life is in constant flux, Machiavelli advised rulers to develop skill at adapting themselves to the times. Quote, I believe that prince may be happy, whose manner of proceeding concerts with the times, and he unhappy, who cannot accommodate to them. From The Prince, chapter 25. This is an essential feature of the Machiavellian approach to power. When applied to governance, such an approach, though divorced from ideology, is not wholly divorced from morality. Instead, Machiavelli encouraged princes to use cruelty when necessary and appeals to morality when politically advantageous. In passage after passage, explained Burnham, Machiavelli returns to this essential ability: neither cruelty nor humaneness, neither rashness nor caution, neither liberality nor avarice avails in the struggle for power unless the times are suited. Indeed, this perfectly explains the hypocrisy so characteristic of politicians. Following Machiavelli's advice, politicians must be hypocritical in order to maintain power. Which brings us to the eighth conclusion Burnham drew from Machiavelli, the necessity of religion in an orderly state. Machiavelli believed religion to be an essential feature of a well-ordered state. As he said, quote, surely it will be found by whoever considers the Roman history how useful a thing religion was to the governing of armies, to the uniting of the people, to keeping of men good, and to deterring them from being bad. Indeed, Machiavelli went so far as to say, quote, take away religion and take away the foundation of government. Those princes and commonwealths who would keep their governments entire and incorrupt are above all things to have a care of religion and its ceremonies, and preserve them in due veneration. From his Discourses on Livy, Book 1, Chapter 11 and 12. Similarly to Sorel's idea of the function of myth, Machiavelli believed that religion plays an indispensable role for the stability of a state. This is not a theological argument, but rather a political one, based on realpolitik, human nature, and the necessary conditions for an orderly civil society. The ninth conclusion Burnham drew from Machiavelli is that republicanism is the ideal form of government. Though Machiavelli believed that the unification of Italy could only occur under the auspices of a monarch, he also believed the best type of government to be a republic. This was because he believed republicanism promised more liberty, which means independence in Machiavelli's use of the word. For Machiavelli, independence is the first condition of liberty. This condition can only be secured by force, more generally by the martial strength of its citizenry. Thus, for Machiavelli, arms are the first foundation of liberty. In other words, if Machiavelli had his way of writing the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution, the right to bear arms would be listed first, not second. Equally important for Machiavelli, there is no permanent safeguard for liberty in anything but one's own strength. Internal liberty rests on government enforcing the rule of law and legal due process, which is guaranteed only by force. Thus, as Burnham put it, law is founded upon force, but the force in turn will destroy the law unless it also is bridled. But force can be bridled only by opposing force. Therefore, only by balancing opposing forces against each other can liberty be preserved, according to Machiavelli. This is what he called mixed government. And this is precisely why Machiavelli believed republicanism to be the highest form of government, because it provides a platform upon which various opposing forces and interests can compete against each other. Thus, these contending forces balance each other out and contribute, at least theoretically, to the stability of government and society. As Burnham summarized, quote, Only out of the continuing clash of opposing groups can liberty flow. The 10th conclusion that Burnham drew from Machiavelli is the latter's concept of fortuna. Machiavelli assigned a major political function in political affairs to this concept he called fortuna. But similarly to the earlier distinction between Machiavelli's virtù and the modern concept of virtue, Machiavelli's concept of fortuna does not correlate to the modern concept of fortune. Machiavelli's use of the term fortuna aligns more closely to opportunism than mere luck or fate. Indeed, Machiavelli's idea of fortuna aligns closely with the adaptive trait required of a ruler. But even beyond adaptation, Machiavelli's idea of fortuna denotes an ability to take initiative and to use each occasion and personal connection to one's advantage. As the old adage goes, fortune belongs to the bold. And that old cliche perhaps encapsulates what Machiavelli meant by fortuna. This concludes my summary of parts 1 and 2 of the Machiavellians. Please subscribe so you don't miss upcoming summaries of the remaining parts 3 through 7, in which Burnham discuss the Machiavellians themselves: Robert Michels, George Sorel, Gaetano Mosca, and Vilfredo Pareto.